Dawn crept across the North Atlantic like a smoldering bruise. A thin mist hung low over the waves, concealing hundreds of dark shapes moving eastward in silent procession. From the air it looked like an endless migration, columns of Liberty ships, oilers, troop transports and escort destroyers carving through the grey waters, their wakes braided together like threads in a single colossal tapestry of war. Each hull bore the mark of American steel. Each deck was crowded with men, tanks, trucks, ammunition, fuel, rations, everything an army could consume in the making of liberation. German reconnaissance pilots flying at high altitude reported the same thing again and again. The sea was crawling with ships. One observer, returning from a mission over the North Atlantic in the winter of 1943, described the sight as beyond comprehension. To the German High Command, those words were unsettling. For years they had mocked American industry as soft, claiming the Americans were consumers, not producers of war. Yet now, as they studied reconnaissance photographs spread across a cold oak table in Berlin, the evidence defied their assumptions. The enemy wasn't just fighting, he was manufacturing the war itself. Only a year earlier, Germany had seemed unstoppable. Its U-boats prowled the Atlantic with near impunity. Convoys burned under the cold moonlight, and Churchill himself had confessed that the Battle of the Atlantic was the only thing that truly frightened him. But in 1943, the tide began to shift. The Americans were arriving, not as individual ships, but as an ocean of steel. Each week, more Liberty ships were launched than the Kriegsmarine could sink. Each month, new escort carriers, destroyer escorts, and long-range bombers appeared, tightening the noose around the once dominant wolf packs. This transformation didn't happen by accident. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the United States had already begun a monumental industrial conversion. Civilian car factories in Detroit were stripped of chrome and comfort, their assembly lines repurposed for tanks, engines, and B-24 bombers. Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards on the West Coast redefined the meaning of speed. A Liberty ship that once took 230 days to build could, by late 1943, be launched in less than 3 weeks. In one stunning display of industrial prowess, Kaiser's yard in Richmond, California, assembled an entire Liberty ship in just under 5 days, a feat that left even Roosevelt astonished. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence analysts received scattered reports of this mass production. They dismissed most of them as exaggerations, propaganda to boost Allied morale. The German mindset was steeped in craftsmanship and precision. A tank was a masterpiece, a submarine an engineering marvel. They couldn't imagine victory coming from quantity over artistry, but war was proving otherwise. The Americans had chosen scale as their weapon. In factories stretching from Pittsburgh to Mobile, from Portland to Baltimore, the hum of industry became the new soundtrack of war. Shipyards worked around the clock. Sparks flew like fireflies as welders stitched together hull after hull, while women, millions of them, filled roles once reserved for men. Their faces, smudged with oil and determination, represented a force the German military had never considered, the mobilization of an entire civilian population. This wasn't an army of soldiers alone. It was an army of workers, engineers, and machinists. By mid-1943, the statistics were staggering. American yards had already launched over 100 Liberty ships, each capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. Every week added another dozen to the fleet. German intelligence officers attempting to calculate Allied shipping capacity found the numbers mathematically absurd. The Kriegsmarine's own analysts began warning Admiral Dönitz that no number of U-boats could stem the tide. For every freighter sunk, 2 more seemed to appear. The ratio of destruction was collapsing. The men aboard those convoys knew it too. Many were young, farm boys from Iowa, steelworkers from Pennsylvania, longshoremen from New York, all part of the vast logistical artery connecting the factories of America to the beaches of Europe. Their ships were slow and often unarmed, yet they sailed with purpose. Beneath the surface, German submarines hunted them relentlessly. Depth charges thundered in the dark, yet the convoys pushed on. For every ship that went down, reinforcements filled its place almost immediately. It wasn't courage alone that kept the convoys alive, it was production. In Berlin, Hitler's advisors grew increasingly anxious. Reports from the Atlantic front painted a grim picture. U-boat losses were accelerating, not just from Allied tactics but from overwhelming replacement rates on the American side. One staff officer reportedly muttered that it was like trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. For the first time, the myth of German industrial invincibility began to crack. The Reich had mastered the art of the weapon, but not the system that sustained it. Meanwhile, in Washington, Roosevelt and his War Production Board tracked progress with military precision. Every new ship was another artery feeding the Allied advance. The president called America the arsenal of democracy, but it was more than that. It was a logistical miracle. Railways delivered steel in endless ribbons to the coast. Oil refineries in Texas powered fleets that stretched across 2 oceans. The same nation that had suffered the Great Depression only a decade before now outproduced the Axis powers combined. By early 1944, Allied naval intelligence confirmed that the Atlantic had effectively turned into an American-controlled corridor. Convoys moved with synchronized precision, cargo ships shielded by destroyers, submarines forced deep by aircraft, and radar systems now mapping the ocean with scientific accuracy. Every operation, from the smallest supply run to the planning of D-Day, relied on the steady pulse of these industrial arteries. Without them, the invasion of Europe would have been impossible. The irony was sharp. Germany's generals had once laughed at the notion that soft Americans could sustain a continental war. Now, staring at reconnaissance photographs of English ports filled with ships, row upon row of hulls waiting to cross the Channel, the laughter was gone. What they saw was not a navy. It was a machine, a self-replicating engine of steel, oil, and manpower that defied destruction. The storm was coming. And this time, it wasn't just soldiers landing on European soil. It was an entire industrial civilization mobilized for war. The second act of the story begins not on the ocean, but inside the factories that made the ocean move. In the winter of 1942, while U-boats prowled the Atlantic and London trembled under V-weapon attacks, the United States was engaged in a quieter but equally decisive campaign, the Industrial War. On assembly lines that had once built refrigerators and sedans, welders and riveters now pieced together the skeletons of ships that would soon thunder toward Europe. It was in these cavernous workshops that the true advantage of America's war effort took shape. The Germans believed industrial warfare meant more tanks and guns. The Americans believed it meant systems, a fusion of design, labor, and logistics that could scale endlessly. At the heart of this transformation were men like Henry J. Kaiser and Donald Douglas, engineers who treated shipbuilding as an engineering equation rather than a craft. Kaiser's concept was radical. Instead of building one ship at a time like an artisan, he broke the process into modular components, each constructed simultaneously and then welded together in record time. Where traditional yards measured output in months, his measured it in days. At the peak of 1943, Kaiser's yards could launch a fully loaded Liberty ship in under a week. German naval attachés who saw the numbers through captured Allied documents called them impossible and dismissed them as fabrication until convoys filled with those ships began appearing in every sector of the Atlantic. The Liberty ship itself was a triumph of functional design. At 441 feet long and displacing 14,245 tons fully loaded, it could carry more than 9,000 tons of cargo at a steady 11 knots. The triple expansion steam engine that powered it was not sophisticated, but it was simple to maintain even by untrained crews. Components were standardized. Parts could be swapped between vessels at sea. To the German mind, raised on the precision of the Kriegsmarine's hand-built U-boats, such crude simplicity seemed laughable. But in the brutal arithmetic of wartime logistics, the Liberty ship's virtue was that it could be built faster than it could be sunk. Even the methods of construction were revolutionary. Welding replaced riveting, reducing both weight and time. Prefabricated sections were shipped by rail from inland factories to coastal yards. Women made up nearly a third of the workforce, their labor measured not in propaganda posters, but in production charts that showed record-breaking output month after month. In the foundries of Pittsburgh, molten steel poured day and night. In Chicago, gears for cargo winches were turned by the thousands. The entire continental United States had become one integrated factory floor. By mid-1943, this system had reached a level of synchronization that bordered on the mathematical. A ship launched from California could, within 3 months, be unloading tanks in Liverpool. Its crew trained en route, its next cargo already allocated by the War Shipping Administration before it even docked. The Germans had no comparable mechanism. Their shipyards, bombed and resource-starved, could barely replace the submarines they lost each month. American industry, by contrast, was not only replacing losses, it was compounding its fleet at a rate of exponential growth. The decisive test of this hidden advantage came during the Battle of the Atlantic's turning point in the spring of 1943. Allied convoys ONS-5 and HX-239 were among the first to demonstrate what total industrial mobilization could achieve when paired with technology. Equipped with newly developed centimetric radar and long-range air cover from escort carriers built in converted civilian yards, these convoys fought back with ruthless efficiency. In 1 week of combat, over 40 German submarines attacked. 30 were sunk or damaged beyond repair. The loss rate shocked Admiral Donitz's command. For every U-boat destroyed, another Liberty ship slid down an American slipway ready to sail within days. The Americans had not only built ships, they had built a supply chain of innovation. The radar sets fitted on escorts were developed by engineers at MIT's Radiation Laboratory. Sonar refinements came from Bell Labs, depth charge mechanisms from small tool companies in Ohio. Each improvement fed directly into production without bureaucratic delay. Every technical manual was updated, printed, and distributed in weeks. It was a living ecosystem of war science that no Axis power could replicate under constant bombing and resource scarcity. Germany, meanwhile, was trapped in the philosophy of the masterpiece. The Type 9C submarine was an engineering marvel, 252 feet long, capable of crossing the Atlantic twice on a single load of diesel, with torpedoes accurate to within meters. But each took nearly a year to build. By 1944, American shipyards could produce the same tonnage in a single day. The contrast was brutal. German officers, reading after-action reports from their surviving U-boats, began to realize the futility. The ocean itself is becoming American, one commander noted in a diary later recovered by the Allies. It was not a metaphor. It was an admission. Yet production alone did not win the Atlantic. The Americans had solved another puzzle: coordination. Using convoy routing centers in Washington and Liverpool, they tracked thousands of ships in real time through coded radio traffic and aerial reconnaissance. If a convoy suffered losses, replacement ships were redirected automatically from nearby ports. It was an embryonic form of network-centric warfare, logistics as strategy. Each Liberty ship was a node in an invisible web that spanned the planet. The Germans tried to adapt. Dönitz pushed for mass production of smaller, faster Type 25 submarines, the so-called electroboats, that could threaten Allied dominance. But by the time prototypes reached testing, the industrial tide had already buried them. Allied bombers had shredded German shipyards, steel supplies were running dry, and synthetic fuel plants barely kept the Luftwaffe airborne. In contrast, the United States was launching a new escort carrier every week, each capable of carrying 30 aircraft to patrol the very seas where U-boats once hunted freely. One battle illustrated the shift perfectly. Convoy HX-300. July 1944. It was the largest convoy ever assembled. 166 merchant ships, 32 escorts stretching over 20 miles of ocean. When German submarines attempted to intercept it, they found the sky filled with aircraft, the surface crawling with sonar-equipped destroyers, and the convoy's formation shifting with mathematical precision. Not a single merchant ship was lost. The message was unmistakable. The Atlantic, once a graveyard of Allied shipping, had become a fortress built of steel signal and sheer productive will. By the end of that summer, American industry had launched more than 2,700 Liberty ships and nearly 500 escort carriers. The ocean lanes were so thick with tonnage that convoys became almost continuous, one leaving port as another arrived. German planners studying aerial photographs of English harbors could no longer count the ships. They had become a blur of hulls and cranes, indistinguishable from the land itself. In Berlin, despair began to replace arrogance. This was the moment when Hitler's gamble collapsed. The Reich had underestimated not just the enemy's courage, but his capacity. The Americans had transformed industrial engineering into a weapon of war, one that fired not shells or torpedoes, but ships. And as those ships filled the horizon, every German commander knew what it meant. The invasion of Europe was no longer a question of if, but when. The thunder of machinery had become the drumbeat of victory. By the winter of 1944, the Atlantic no longer felt like an ocean. It felt like a machine, vast, tireless, and unstoppable. Convoys stretched from New York to Plymouth in endless procession, their wakes merging into a single metallic heartbeat that pulsed across the grey expanse. German U-boats still lurked, but their hunts had become acts of desperation. The Americans had turned the sea itself into a factory floor, where every wave carried cargo, and every horizon shimmered with the promise of more steel on the way. The war had entered its industrial crescendo, and the sound of victory was not the roar of guns but the thrum of engines. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Allied sailors, once haunted by the thought of dying in cold water, now sailed with confidence. Their convoys moved under the cover of radar air power, and numbers so overwhelming that the ocean felt secure. Men who had watched friends vanish beneath burning oil slicks in 1942 were now part of something invincible. "We own the Atlantic," one American officer wrote home, "and it feels like owning the world." The Germans, by contrast, began to speak of the Atlantic as cursed. In the diaries of U-boat captains, once filled with pride and precision, the entries grew shorter, bleaker. "There is no room left for us," one wrote in late 1944. "They have filled the sea." Strategically, the consequences were decisive. The sheer mass of tonnage delivered to Britain, millions of tons each month, transformed the island into a forward operating base of unparalleled power. American tanks, aircraft, and fuel arrived faster than they could be unloaded. The build-up for Operation Overlord depended entirely on this logistical miracle. Without those Liberty ships and the industrial web that fed them, D-Day would have been impossible. Every Higgins boat that landed on Omaha Beach, every Sherman tank that rolled through Normandy, had crossed the ocean in the belly of a ship designed by engineers who would never see battle. In that sense, the victory in France began in the shipyards of Richmond and Baltimore. The Germans, forced to confront this reality, turned their attention to terror weapons, V-1s and V-2s, hoping to offset material inferiority with fear. But even as the rockets fell on London, Allied shipyards built replacements faster than the bombs could destroy them. The US economy had become an organism that thrived on challenge. Every setback fed its momentum. When the port of Antwerp was damaged, engineers rerouted supplies through Cherbourg. When U-boats sank tankers in the Caribbean, the Americans built new refineries and pipeline systems across the continent. The industrial system had achieved something the German war machine never could: resilience. That resilience was psychological as much as mechanical. In Germany, defeat had become taboo. In America, adaptation was celebrated. Workers in Oregon competed with those in Virginia for fastest ship launch times. Newspapers printed front-page stories not of generals but of welders and foremen who had won the week. Each new Liberty ship carried a name, often chosen by the public, creating a sense of personal ownership in the war effort. Civilians felt they were launching pieces of themselves into the Atlantic. It was mass participation turned into maritime power. When Germany finally collapsed in May 1945, the industrial numbers told their own story. The United States had produced over 5,000 merchant vessels, 2,700 Liberty ships, and 531 Victory ships. Together, they carried more than 95 million tons of cargo across the Atlantic: food, weapons, soldiers, oil, hope. The Kriegsmarine, which had once prowled the seas with over 1,000 U-boats, saw nearly 800 of them destroyed. The industrial duel had ended in annihilation, not through superior guns but through unbreakable production. America had discovered a weapon Hitler never understood: the assembly line. But the legacy of that production went far beyond 1945. The system of integration, design, supply, manufacturing, deployment became the foundation for the Cold War military-industrial complex. The same methods used to build Liberty ships evolved into the infrastructure for nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, and intercontinental bombers. Engineers who had once welded steel plates for convoys now calculated missile trajectories. The idea that industrial scale could decide wars shaped U.S. doctrine for generations. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Persian Gulf, the lessons of the Liberty ship echoed through every logistical convoy and supply airlift. For Germany, the psychological scar remained. In post-war interviews, former officers admitted that the scale of American industry had broken their faith in victory long before Berlin fell. One recalled watching reconnaissance photos of English ports filled beyond capacity. We could not believe what we saw. The ships were endless. It was as if they were growing from the sea. That sense of futility spread through the ranks, from U-boat crews to general staff. The myth of technological superiority, so central to Nazi propaganda, had drowned under the weight of American mass production. Yet for all its scale, the American effort never lost sight of the human element. Behind every ship stood thousands of hands, men and women, black and white, immigrants and farmers, all bound by a shared purpose. Their welds and rivets outlasted the ideologies that tried to dominate them. The Liberty ships themselves became symbols of endurance. Many survived decades beyond the war, repurposed for trade, aid, and research. They were floating memorials to the notion that collective effort, when guided by purpose, could reshape history. The story also carried a warning. In later decades, historians and engineers alike noted that America's triumph had come from an economy mobilized for survival, an alignment of science, labor, and leadership rarely seen again. The challenge for future generations, they said, was not merely to remember the ships, but to remember what made them possible: unity of direction. The factories that roared in 1943 did so, not because they were ordered to, but because millions believed the fight mattered. And so, as the guns of Europe fell silent and the last convoys returned home, the Atlantic transformed once more. Where once lay wreckage and fire, there were now rows of ships at anchor, their decks quiet, their flags at rest. In the fading light of victory, an engineer watching from the shore might have felt both pride and exhaustion, knowing that his work, built in steel and sweat, had changed the world. The Liberty ship was never beautiful, never glamorous, but it was immortal in its purpose. In the end, the Germans had been right about one thing: America's ships did seem to grow from the sea. But what they failed to understand was that those ships were not miracles of metal. They were manifestations of belief, of collective endurance forged in iron and hope. And that belief, once awakened, could not be sunk. For in modern war, it is not the sharpest sword that wins, but the hand that can forge 1,000 more. The Americans had proved it beyond question. And in the endless tide of steel that carried freedom to Europe, the world learned the cost and the power of industry turned to purpose.